As I said, I'm with the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Reno, Nevada. From the repeat photography of mine, what they've already shown, I think you have an idea. I've been working in the Great Basin for a while on PJ woodlands. Expansion of Great Basin woodlands is generating interest and has since the middle of the 20th century in harvesting the either controlling the trees and now in harvesting the resulting biomass for other uses. Now, the success of such utilization is going to depend on the long-term stability of that biomass. As I said earlier this morning, you probably need at least a reliable product for at least 30 years to justify the investment. Now, present and future climate change has implications on such a sustainability, and to kind of look at what that might be, I'm going to look at how these tree species have responded to past climate change. Peter briefly touched on that. I'm going to go into it a little more detail. The Reno lab of the Rocky Mountain Research Station has been doing paleo work on climate and vegetation change in the Great Basin for a little over 20 years now, using wood rat middens. Wood rat is rather a cute little fuzzy creature with big ears. It's vegetarian, and he builds nests back in caves and rock crevices. And he builds them out of plant material, and they're also vegetarian, and they glue that material together with their urine, which is, when fresh, is about the consistency of molasses, and then hardens into a rock-like substance. And over thousands of generations of plant material and such, they build up these huge nests. They kind of look like a black piece of rock sticking in there, but it's all crystalline urine, and inside of that is all the plant materials they brought into the nest preserved. We have middens going back 30,000 years, and the materials coming out of that look like they fell off the plant 2 years ago. The decay has totally stopped. So it makes a very nice way of looking at that. Now, this is a canyon in the Virginia mountains on the west side of Pyramid Lake. Over the 20 years, we've sampled a series of middens from the bottom to the top of this canyon. They give a very nice picture of how vegetation has responded to past climate. The highest midden is in this cave right up here. And just a quick close-up, the middens we sample are up in the top of this cave in here, back in where they're protected from the weather. This is a sample from one of those middens right after I took it out. Those are white bark pine needles, and they're little 5-needle bundles. This particular stuff has been sitting in this midden for 9,600 years. And you can see what kind of shape they're in. They're basically untouched. Wood rat urine is an excellent preservative. Okay. Pardon? Does it smell? I always do, when we soak up the middens, when we work on them, we do it in a fume hood. Otherwise, the rest of the building can't stand us. Okay, this is a view. I'm standing near the mouth of that cave looking back down the canyon. Back here you can see Pyramid Lake. Now, Pyramid Lake is a remnant of former Lake Lahontan. If you look on this mountain, you can see a line right across it there. That's the high water line when Lake Lahontan was full. Now, in addition to the midden I'm up by, we have others down through here, and the very lowest midden is in this rock outcrop way down here. In that midden, we have strata going from the present back to 30,000 years. And in those strata, from 12,000 years to 30,000 years, are several that also contain white bark pine. But the last time we see it down here is 12,000 years ago. The midden behind me, we have strata from the present back to almost 20,000 years. White bark pine are in most of those from 9,600 to nearly 20. After 9,600, it's no longer there. It's nowhere on that mountain range today. Its nearest location is 40 miles away at 9,000 feet on the Carson Range above Lake Tahoe. So it was down here at 12,000. It was where I'm standing at 9,600, and now it's at 9,000 feet. So 12,000 years ago, this site down here was sitting at the transition between subalpine and mountain brush. 9,600 years ago, the site I'm standing at was. Today, it's all the way up at 9,600. Now, one reason I wanted to show that is in every midden strata we sampled in this midden site, every midden strata in this mass behind me, and in every other midden up and down this canyon, there is juniper. For several points in several strata, from 12,000 on back, it's growing with whitebark pine. The community outside that midden today is at the sagebrush salt desert shrub transition. It has both sagebrush and shed scale, both of which are in the midden. So you have juniper persisting in this canyon for the last 30,000 years, right through glacial maximum and into the current Holocene. It is never missing. That immediately told us there's something genetically going on here. There has to be. So we initiated our first study, and this was published in 2000. We hired Randall Torry as a postdoc who did all the genetic work for us. And what this is we located several juniper chloroplast DNA haplotypes. And then we sampled populations across the Great Basin here. And this is the proportion of the number of trees in each population that had one or more of those western juniper haplotypes. Or one or more of the trees represented that. Where the circles are black, or squares are black, it's 100%. All the trees did. Because the grayscale wasn't coming up very much. I color marked it. Brown here, 50 to 80% of the trees contain western juniper haplotypes. Where it's green, 14 to 33%, and only where it's open was it pure Utah juniper. One here, 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 and there. 4 out of the whole thing. In other words, we've got hybridization of western juniper into Utah juniper clear across the Great Basin, even all the way into the low levels into Colorado. And that is how these trees, well, the western juniper today on the Sierras, you can find it in association with whitebark pine. Utah juniper today is down there in the shed scale. And what we think is going on is climate shifts. This tree is just simply shifting its genetics. So the seed rain coming out covers a wider range of environments, or capability of surviving in a wider range of environments that exists. So as the climate shifts, different subsets of the seeds germinate and survive, allowing this tree to genetically shift. And climate has never been static long enough for any of this climate variability, this ability to vary with climate, to be dropped out of the population. Climate has just been shifting too fast. Well, Randall Torry expanded on this study recently in the paper in 2010. Here's the 9 haplotypes he used at this time. He ran a principal components analysis of each one. And then the x-axis is our principal components analysis. And then this is Utah juniper areas. This is western juniper, and this is kind of a transition. Region 1 is central Nevada over into Utah. Region 2 is western Nevada, and region 3 is Oregon. And you see the Oregon haplotypes just come over into this. And you have haplotype 4 here kind of coming across, and as you get down, it's more and more into the Utah juniper. And here's the map of those. In each circle is each haplo. Oregon is all 9, but 9 is also here, here, and here. And here we have 2, 4, 6, 7, and 8, 2, 4, and 5, 1 and 2. 1 and 1, the pure Utah, is only over here. At least there's 1 and 2, and then all the other mixes. So again, even using this different set of haplotypes, we're still seeing this hybridization clear across the basin. And there is a way you can morphologically identify these hybrids. A pure western juniper, I don't know if you know, juniper has these little scale leaves that are pressed to the stem. In the back of each of those scales is a gland, and that gland exudates little white drops of resin. In Utah juniper, there are no glands exposed on those leaves, so no exudation. As you get various levels of hybridization, the frequency of leaves, or little scale leaves with that gland dot, increases. Very low levels, just an occasional one. It's the level of juniper, and the cycle goes up, you get more and more of them. If you pick a branch off a juniper and you can see those white exudating glands, you know there's western juniper in that tree. The juniper's primary strategy for coping with climate change appears to be this genetic ability to adapt. Now, you can stay on a site, and one point in time you're growing white bark pine, another time you're growing with shed squale. That's a tremendous ability to adapt. And this is accomplished through the hybridization of the western and Utah juniper. Cooler, wetter sites have juniper more similar to western juniper. Warmer, dry sites have juniper more similar to Utah juniper. And this genetics has gone clear out across the basin. In fact, there's some ranges in central Nevada, like Mount Jefferson and the Tequimas. The lowest elevation is juniper. As you go up, it becomes mixed pinyon and juniper. You go up a little further, it goes almost pure pinyon. Then you pick up juniper again as you go up. The juniper goes more. Finally, juniper is what's invading upslope. Almost everywhere else in the basin is pinyon. If you look at that population of juniper at the lower end, it's pretty much Utah. You look at that population at the upper end, it is strongly associated with western. So there's basically two juniper populations that have spread its ability to occupy that mountain range. Question then becomes, how does the genetics of pinyon compare? Well, over the last few years, we found some of these answers. The first one to recognize it was Bailey. In 1987, in a pine symposium in Mexico, he published this map, where morphologically he identified 5 pinyon taxa across the southwest. Pinus monophylla, that we have in the Great Basin, what he called Pinus californium, subspecies californium, which is over in here, Californium phalax, which is down across here, Edulis is here, and then Quadrifolia, which sits down in here and down in the Baja. Now recently, Ken Cole and his co-authors, he's with the USGS and Flagstaff, did a more detailed look at this and statistically demonstrated these 4 taxa, Monophylla, Edulis, Phalax, and Californian, are significantly different in their needle morphology and probably other things as well. You can kind of see the differences there. Now here is a principal components analysis. This is axis 1 and 2, or actually stomata lines. Each of these species have different number of stomata lines and different numbers of resin canals. And you compare them, stomata line to resin canal, here's where Pinus monophylla falls, here's where Californium falls, and here's where both Edulis and Phalax fall. However, here you can tell those apart, being Edulis always has 2 needles, Phalax always has 1. What have I got next here? Okay, now the final thing is this map, and this is his revised map of the distributions of these. With Edulis here, Phalax here, Californium down through here, and of course Monophylla up here in Nevada and other parts of the Great Basin. Now there's 2 primary climatic factors that separate these 4 taxa. The first one is winter temperature. You have colder winters, you've got Edulis, and you've got Monophylla. You have warmer winters, you've got Californium, and you have Phalax. The second climatic factor that separates these is summer precipitation. Where summer precipitation represents a significant part of the total, you have either Edulis or Phalax. Where summer precipitation is a minor part and essentially non-existent, you have Monophylla or Californium. And this same summer precipitation gradient influences the resin canal numbers. The higher the summer drought stress, the higher number of resin canals, with primarily pinions, Monophylla and Californium having the highest numbers. In fact, a while back we did a free water transpiration study of single-leaf pinyon, which varies from 2 to 10 depending on where you find it. And what we found is the ability of the trees to transpire water under unrestricted conditions is significantly correlated with the number of resin canals. And what I think that has to do is, with high resin canal areas, the only moisture you're going to have is what's there when temperature's warm enough to grow. It was winter precipitation, it's going to be nothing else. So you open up and you crank your photosynthesis as fast as you can go for as long as that water's left. Because it's evaporating on the ground as fast as you're cranking it out. And then as soon as the water's gone, you shut down. And I think all those resin canals have something to do with the ability of that tree to resist summer drought. Because the higher it is, the higher those number of resin canals. This is all speculation. Nobody's ever really studied it. It's just where the evidence seems to be pointing. Now, in the mid-90s, Eric LaHood, working with Paul Keim at Northern Iowa University, did the only genetic study of pinyon I'm aware of. Now, this really needs to be repeated with our much better techniques we now have. But there's some interesting results here. First of all, pinyon is a white pine. A lot of people aren't aware of that. You go back into Mexico where you have your most ancient species, like Maxa Martinez, it's a 5-needle pine. And as this species migrated north and adapted to drier and drier climates, needle number went down to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. Now what this dendrogram seems to be showing is there were 2 separate evolutions of the single needle condition. One going from Pinus remorta to Edulis to Phalax and Californarium. The other one going from discolor to quadrifolia to monophylla. Now, if more recent genetic data supports this, it seems apparent why monophylla and Edulis very seldom hybridize. They have very different genetic origins, although they both go all the way back to Symbroides. Unlike Juniper, which can both adapt and migrate, Pinion's ability to cope with climate change is pretty much confined to migration. Its taxa have very strict climate factors it is found in. Pinion, however, has demonstrated the ability to migrate rapidly, and we have increasing evidence to that. 12,000 years ago, Pinion was on the valley floor where Las Vegas is today. The vegetation there was a Pinion juniper woodland with a sagebrush understory. And my first introduction to that is what got me into this whole work in the first place. I was attending a meeting down in Las Vegas, and I took the paleo field trip. We went out on the west side of town, this big limestone outcrop. We went in a cave. The guy leading the field trip took a miner's pick and slammed a wood rat mitt and broke a piece off. And when it came down, there laying on top of that piece was a pinion cone. Outside the mouth of that cave was creosote. You had to go 3,000 feet up the Spring Mountains to find pinion. Okay, something going on here. With the warming of the end of the Pleistocene came Pinion's migration, and it went both upward and it went northward. And here's our first approximation of that in a paper we published in 1994. Since then we've gotten some updates on ages. Just recently we accelerated dated actual Pinion samples out of a midden on the west side of the Toyabe Mountains, located right about there. And the age came out 7,000 years. So 11 to 7, it was already here. Recent dates from City of Rocks in Idaho up here put it there by 4,000. Now if you look at the distance from Las Vegas to City of Rocks, and you divide that by the appropriate number of years, you get a migration rate on average that's approximately the length of a football field a year. For a species that doesn't really produce seed in any kind of abundance until it's 50 to 70 years old, that's trucking. Ecologically, that's really moving along. And that's part of this ability, the expansion we've recently seen. It really has the ability. Its own seed doesn't have wings, but it uses birds and mammals very effectively to get those seeds distributed out huge areas very quickly. Equally important to the sustainability of biomass harvest is how Pinion and Juniper have responded to more recent climate change. And there's some interesting patterns that have followed the end of the Little Ice Age as climate changed. This is the period of time when we've seen a dramatic increase in the area occupied by the woodlands and the density of trees within those woodlands. The patterns of tree establishment since then, particularly during the 20th century, I think may be unique to that period. At least there's nothing like it over the last several hundred years. This is age data, all the trees and a series of sites in one canyon in the Shoshone Mountains. And I've divided these into high and low tree dominance. Low tree dominance, the understory still has a significant part of the ecosystem. In high tree dominance, the trees are dominating the site. Now what's interesting is for both sites you see exactly the same pattern. A 20th century acceleration and a peak of establishment and then a decline. Now the rate of tree establishment by decade on the low establishment sites is directly related to that on the high site. If you do a correlation analysis between the by decade numbers from 1890 to 2000, they are significantly correlated. One goes up, the other goes up. If one goes down, the other goes down. Now this pulse is the part that I think is really unique because this just keeps showing up. Here's two sites in southern Nevada, Franco Biondi's work. This is the same Mount Irish that Peter was referring to. Well, this is a separate graduate student, Megan Bradley, who did the basic ecology on it and aged all the trees. And then there's also Mount Clover Mountains he worked on. On both of them, we see that same 20th century pulse. Here's the data from the dissertation site down in southwestern Utah for pinyon. Same pulse. And this ties into the data Douglas Shimmerman showed. You know, if you had that same pulse in there for pinyon, juniper on this site was almost a constant rate of establishment for the last 300 years. And on Mount Irish, it was the same way. You get north of there, and the establishment of juniper shows, of Utah juniper shows the same pulse as the establishment of pinyon. You get up into western juniper, you get the same thing, as I'll show you in a minute. Now here's three more sites. One is the East Tintic Mountains in Utah, one is Shoshone Mountains in Nevada, one Juniper Mountain in Idaho. The top row is what we call post-settlement. These are sites where the oldest tree was less than 160 years old. Pre-settlement, the oldest tree was 160 or more years old. And almost always, if we had a tree at 160 or more, we had trees a lot older. What we see here is this pulse is occurring on the post-settlement stuff that's going out into sites where the sagebrush is currently dominating, as well as on established woodland sites where it's infilling. Now, I now have located 21 sites across the Great Basin where I have been able to assemble the needed age data, and all of them show this 20th century pulse. What's also interesting is on most of them, the number of trees establishing per decade in the pre-settlement significantly exceeds the number of trees establishing per decade in the post-settlement. You notice this is 120 and this is 200. This is consistent. But conversely, because we have the quantitative data to go with most of these sites, the growth rate of the trees here is significantly greater than the growth rate of those. So those establishing in the sagebrush establish at a lower rate, but they grow faster. Those establishing with existing woodlands are establishing at a higher rate, but they're growing slower. Okay, there's other places this shows up. I think this post-Little Ice Age period is something we need to be looking at more carefully. This is Pinus symbroides on the Nature Conservancy's Davis Mountain Preserve in southwest Texas. We got the pulse. Here's a tree establishment of lodgepole pine and grand fir on a montane meadow in the Cascade Range of Oregon. And then Douglas Shinneman's data, showing us there's something going on here. And there is some kind of environmental change that has occurred as we transitioned out of the Little Ice Age that for 100 years or maybe a little more promoted a rapid expansion of woody vegetation. It's interesting that the expansion of creosote and the expansion of mesquite in Arizona and New Mexico approximately coincide with this same period. There's something going on here. But I think that environmental potential, whatever it is just that, it's a potential. Where that was able to express itself on the landscape and how dense those woody species got, I think was at least equally influenced by the land use practices that were occurring on those sites. So it's a complex mix of environment and land use that we need to figure out what's going on, because that's going to have a significant impact on where things go in the future as climate continues to change. Now, coming back to this one, I just want to come here for a minute, because I have quantitative data for a lot of these, and what it consistently shows for almost all sites is these trees established between 1910 and about 1970. Their total biomass is the majority of the tree biomass on the plot. And this is across the basin, and that dominance is increasing with time as these trees continue to grow. Whether it is an established woodland or a post-settlement woodland, these trees are now dominating the site. They're what's generating all the biomass and has generated all the interest and the recognition that this expansion is occurring. Now, we want to know, okay, we've got these two types of sites. What's the general relative proportion of the two across the basin? So in 4 mountain ranges, we put a series of transects clear across the mountain. And every 800 meters, we sampled whatever that point landed on. This is for the woodland sites for Utah and Nevada. Idaho and Oregon look very similar to this. Their timing is slightly different, but very similar. What we find across Nevada and Utah is that almost 80% are post-settlement age stands. Only about 20% or slightly more are pre-settlement age. So that says that probably at least 3/4 of the woodlands in the Great Basin represent trees that expanded out into sites that were at that time sagebrush dominated. Now, I don't know how much of that is reinvasion following boom well disturbance, how much is invasion in the site where trees never existed. But for what I'm talking about here, it's not particularly important. It's just we have this high abundance of these young tree sites. This is the same picture Peter showed. This is to define phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1, the expansion. Phase 2, rapid tree takeover. Phase 3, full tree dominance. Now, this was a different view of the same mountain he showed, 1973, 2007. And one thing I want to point out, this phase 3 right here, and this phase 3 right here, let's back up on me, yeah. That was phase 1 in 73, and so was this. And it went all the way from phase 1 to phase 3 in 34 years. Most of it went from phase 1 to phase 2, with a little phase 2 to phase 3 there. Here's another one, part of the chaining study. What I want to look at here is this mountain in the background. Mostly phase 1 with some phase 2, maybe a little phase 3 back in 71. 2008, trees have almost totally covered the mountain. The chaining down in the foreground, this was done with the Ely chain. It was chained 2 ways. It was heavily seeded. But the chaining took out maybe 40 to 50% of the tree density survived, the little guys for the most part. 39 years later, you're in the latter part of phase 2. Without that dominating overstory, those surviving trees really took off. And when I sampled these chainings between 2 and 13 years after they were chained, I was getting 1/4-inch growth rings and 1-foot leader growth. These trees were really released. Okay, now we took those same cross-mountain transects and we separated them into the same 3 phases. And what we found was 40% in phase 1, 50% in phase 2, phase 2, and a little over 10% in phase 3. Now what it turns out, this is pre-settlement, and about 1/5 off the top of here is pre-settlement, leaving about 40% phase 1, 40% phase 2. Or 40% phase 1, phase 2 in the post-settlement status. I forgot to back up. So what that means, you look at that previous graph where I showed that accelerated expansion during phase 2. What that says is by the middle of this century, essentially all of this is going to be stacked over here. And some portion of this, maybe 20% on top of it. So by the middle of this century, for the woodlands that have survived that long, probably 2/3 of them are going to be fully tree dominated. We are right now, for the basin as a whole, woodlands as a whole, somewhere in the upper end of that rapid acceleration curve. We are really putting on the biomass. And fuel loads on average across the basin will probably double between now and the middle of the century. And what that is leading to is this. This is a phase 3 post-settlement woodland of young trees that became very dense. This fire burned 6,000 acres in the first 8 hours. Now, all the multiple burns that Peter and John Bauer measured there in Barrett Canyon, high-intensity fires, but small in size and relatively frequent, their total area is probably not much more, maybe even less than this burned in 8 hours. We've seen a significant shift in burn patterns. And I've seen other burn studies in woodlands from other areas. You go in the past, it's frequent, high intensity, but relatively small fires. Now we are increasingly seeing this. Stand replacement, high intensity fires that go romping across huge areas of landscape. Because as these woodlands have closed in, as these trees have grown, we're increasing the fuel continuity across larger and larger areas. The understory here is converting again cheatgrass and tumble mustard. Not a pretty picture. Based on the tree response to past climate change, considerable changes can be expected just in woodlands over this century. Both species show a remarkable ability to cope with climate change, either very rapid migration or a combination of adaptation and migration. The climate change that projected to occur over the century may be up to 10 times faster than any change we have recorded in the last 30,000 years. An example of that is we have a midden site in central Nevada in the Torry Mountains. And looking at IPCC data, climate data, between sometime prior to 2,500 years ago to about 1,400 years ago, we had a 2-degree centigrade increase in global temperature. On that midden site, over that 2-degree change, we went from subalpine fir to shed scale. At 3,000 years ago, subalpine fir and pinyon. 1,400 years ago, was shed scale, and the tree species were gone. In fact, subalpine fir isn't even on the Toyabis anymore. And we had it in multiple middens and strata back around that period. So it just got shoved right off the top of the mountain. For trees that needed 50 to 70 years to reproduce, these future changes, we're going to duplicate that same temperature change in 100 years. We're probably too fast for them to fully cope. I think the trees are going to be dying out of unsuitable areas faster than they're going to be able to migrate into or adapt to some of these climate changes that we're going to be receiving. However, I think there will be landscape areas that have trees today that will still have trees at mid-century and probably well beyond. These trees have a very wide ecological amplitude. So even though climate shifts, there's going to be some area in there where they're going to be able to survive. Now, these are probably the areas that could supply a sustained yield of biomass for harvest and other uses. However, we're going to need additional research to understand where these areas are located and what the biomass levels are going to be. And this is just my conjecture. With the rate of increase in biomass currently occurring and the increase in continuity of that biomass across the landscape, by the middle of this century, I think the combination of fire, insects, and disease, and we saw earlier pictures over in Arizona and such of disease, and particularly bark beetles really taking out large areas. That is increasingly happening in the Great Basin. We're getting Ips beetle, we're getting scale insect, and we're getting sawfly that's taking out larger and larger areas every year. And I think that trend is only going to continue, particularly during drought times when those trees are highly stressed. In my projection, I probably won't be around to see whether it comes true or not, but I am projecting that by the middle of this century, an area that might be as much as half of the woodlands that were present at the beginning of the century will no longer exist. I don't know how true, but I think we're going to see some significant changes, and we're going to need to be doing some extensive monitoring to track them